Hello again, everyone. Today we get into the second episode of our review games of Catalan opening. Now, in the last video, we talked about the possibility of white playing the move queen to c2 as opposed to knight to e5 to actually get into a winning position, or a fighting position at least, to fight for a win. Both sides can get a possibility to win, and also the imbalances they look for, rather than a theoretical draw, for example. And today I just want to show you what I mean by that. So without further ado, let's just jump ahead to the game that is played by some of the Grandmasters out there. Now this game is not really played by the top Grandmasters, but white is played by Yakubboev Nodirbek, a very strong Grandmaster from Uzbekistan, and also the black side is played by Ervan Mohammad, a player from Indonesia. He qualified for the World Cup in the Asian Continental Individual Championship. And so if I'm not mistaken, this tournament will actually qualify the top 6-7 players to the World Cup in Sochi, Russia this July in 2021. So also one of the most important tournament right there. So without further ado, we'll just jump ahead to the game. Now white starts off with pawn to c4. Again, there's a flexibility to this opening. White can start with pawn to d4 as well. White can start with knight to f3. There's a flexibility, but pawn to c4 is what Yakubboev tried to do in his opening to maintain the flexibility to transpose to other opening if possible. Ervan continues with pawn to e6, and after g3, d5, bishop g2, knight f6, knight f3, bishop to e7, castle, castle. This is the classical line of the Catalan opening after pawn to d4. So again, after dc4, we see queen to c2, the opening that, or the main line, one of the main lines that we actually thought it will be useful for white to actually gain a win in this tempo. Or apologize, should I say in this game. Here black continues with the main line with pawn to a6, and after pawn to a4, black continues with bishop to d7, queen c4, and after bishop to c6, bishop to f4, bishop to d6. Now we see nothing new, we actually discussed this before. Bishop d6 also trying to exchange off the powerful bishop that is sitting on f4, trying to double the pawn on f4 as well. So this is the idea we have seen before as well. White in this case deviate from the main line and plays bishop to g5, trying to then pin down the knight to the queen and try to bamboozle the kingside mistake that black can incur over there, right? Black in this case plays knight to d7, a very nice move to protect the knight on f6, so that the queen can actually move somewhere in this position, without having to worry about the knight on f6 of course. Now in this position, Yakubboev just developed with knight to c3, and after h6 trying to kick away the bishop right there, Yakubboev traded off the bishop for the knight and placed pawn to a5. Now pawn to a5 is actually a very nice move in my opinion because it advances the pawn onto the queen side, trying to gain space right there, but also trying to prevent some of the more important moves like b5 or b6. So once b5 and b6 happens, we can actually just take the pawn and we can claim the open a file right here. We can claim, just major advantage in terms of space as well, right? And also the broken structure on the queen side. Now black continues with queen to e7. It'll be impossible in this position to play pawn to b5 or pawn to b6 because the bishop is quite hanging on c6 and nothing is protecting it. So it's impossible to play b6 or b5 as well in this position. So queen e7 is played. And after rook to e1, trying to get the pawn onto e4, trying to control as much center or space as possible in the center. Black plays bishop to b4, trying to get this knight off. So of course, if you play e4 right now, the bishop will take on c3 and this e4 pawn will be hanging. So in this position, Yakubboev chose to play rook c1, just getting the rook out of the line of the bishop. And here Ervan just moves back with bishop to d6. Yakubboev continued with queen d3, preparing the idea of pawn to e4 once more. And again, bishop to b4 is played. And so that actually signifies that black doesn't know what he's trying to do, or at least he's trying to draw the game quite comfortably here. Yakubboev isn't letting that happen. He plays pawn to e3, trying to get more imbalances as possible, so of course he can actually have a win on the scoreboard against a lower rated opponent. Ervan continues with rook a c8, a move that actually just protects the c-pawn, but other than that, we don't know what the rook will actually do there. And after queen c4, bishop d6, and queen b3, let's just face it that this opening or this game is not very exciting as we thought it would be, right? But the key idea is definitely there, and since your opponent doesn't know what he's doing, there's no rush in actually doing some sacrificing or crazy move. One of the way to win games when your opponent doesn't know what he's doing is basically trying to improve your position, trying to find a way for your piece to belong in so that can actually have a maximum amount of effect or damage to your opponent's structure, right? And so in this particular moment, White is just trying to do that. Trying to find a way for his piece to actually have a maximum effect, and also trying to induce a mistake from black. Here Ervan continues with rook to b8, again moving your rook back and forth, signifying that you perhaps do not know what you're trying to do here, but also in this case perhaps he's trying to just get pawn to b5 in. Yakubboev continued with knight to d2, and of course Ervan traded off the bishop and placed rook to d8. Again, pawn to b6 or pawn to b5 is still not possible due to the idea of knight to e4. Now you should always look out for what your opponent is trying to do, and pawn to b5 just doesn't actually do that. Pawn to b5 just expands on the queen side, while the action is happening on the center of the board. Now of course with the knight coming on to the center of the board, it's hard to actually ignore that, right? Because actually knight to e4 in this position tries to take the bishop on d6, trying to bamboozle the position. And let's say that black actually exchange off the knight, we'll still have the knight actually threaten to take the bishop. And of course you can stay ignoring rook to d8, and after knight d6, let's say we can actually just play rook to c6. Rook to c1 will be trying to actually infiltrate and trying to double up on the queen side and try to infiltrate this way. And so, this kind of little things is what actually causes the win and the loss in a game. And so you might want to actually pay attention to that as well. So pawn b5 is just a fancy move that does nothing at all in the position. So this is also one of the concepts you want to pay attention to when you're playing into your game, is to actually look out for what your opponent is trying to do. And from the knight on c3 and d2, it is very clear that they actually want to try to put the knight on e4 and try to bamboozle some of the structure on the king side right there. In this case, Ervan plays rook to d8, trying to meet the threat of knight to d6 with rook to d6 simply, where it controls more of the center, where you can get the rook onto the play. In this moment, Yakubboev chose to play knight to a4. I have no idea why he played that move. That move is far inferior than the move, knight to e4, for example. It's very inferior to the move knight e4. At least knight e4 is trying to actually threaten to exchange the bishop. The move knight a4 is accomplishing nothing, and is threatening to do nothing as well onto the queen side right here. And so I do not have any idea why he plays that. But again, this is the moment where Ervan actually tries to strike on the center of the board by playing pawn to e5. A very nice move in my opinion, because again, if you lack space and your opponent's doing nothing, again, you want to change the structure a little bit by playing pawn to e5, trying to change the structure so that it can work onto your advantage. And also when you lack space, you want to actually change the structure so they can actually have more lines for your piece to infiltrate in. More lines means more possibility of your pieces going into an attack right here. And so pawn to e5 does just that. After pawn to e5, because there's no, other nice move, queen to e5. And now we do see a semi-open e-file, the rook can get into e-file, the knight can get to d5, and, the other rook can get to d-file. And in the end of the day, black can still have some play in this game. So white actually realizes the mistake, plays knight back to c3. So this just further proves that knight to a4 is a useless move that white should not play before. Now Ervan continues with pawn to c6. Pawn to c6 actually looks nice because it stops the knight, or any pieces in fact, to drop on d5, right? But in doing this, we actually leave the pawn on b7 being very weak. So some pieces or some rook actually have to stay on the b-file and protect the pawn on b7. Furthermore, the square on b6 is totally under white's control. Before this, the pawn on c7 also helps control the pawn or the square on b6. But after advancing the pawn on c6, now you can see the square on b6 is actually very weak, and it's actually under white's control that white can exploit into. And so in a few moments we'll see how white does that and actually went on to win this stale and dry game. White continues with knight to f3, trying to bring his pieces to the center of the board, attacking the queen as well. And after queen h5, we do see queen to c4, and in a couple of moves we do see a fancy trade after knight to d7, knight to e4, queen f3, king f3, and knight to e5, forking the king and the queen so they can be picked up, rook c4, and bishop to e7. Now Ervan in this position actually offered a draw after playing bishop to e7 that Yakubboev clearly rejects. He rejected the draw, of course, because of the advantage that he has on the queen side right here, the b6 square, the weak b7 pawn, and the major advantage on the queen side after he pushed on b4 is something that Yakubboev is trying to hold on to try to win the game. And so of course he rejected the draw, because he clearly understands black has nothing here, while white has something to fight for. Mainly the advantage on the queen side, and also let's say, if you can actually just get an advantage on the king side as well. Apparently he has what is called the 4-on-3 advantage. That means you have more pawns on one side than your opponent does, right? In this case, black has 3, white has 4. That's called the 4-on-3 advantage. The 4 pawns versus the 3 pawns advantage. And of course, the queen side pawn over here for black does nothing because this b7 pawn is really, really weak. And so the 2 pawns on the queen side actually just serves as a purpose to stop the advancement of the pawn on the queen side. That's why the c6 move is actually such a bad move, in my opinion, of course, because it weakened the square on b6 and b7 so much. So much that black actually wishes that it can actually drop the pawn back to c7 and control some of the square a little bit more. And here Yakubboev just continues with pawn to g4. He has a lot of plan and he's just following with one of them, mainly is to push on the king side to get this pawn to queen if possible. Black rook to d5, but after knight c3, it's kicked back to d7, and so he lost some tempo there, but does protect the pawn on b7. So we will see how useful this move is, of course. After rook to d1, rook d8. This is not right, in my opinion. My suggestion was to take on d1, and let's say after the king takes or the knight takes, it doesn't really matter. We can actually just get rook to d8 where we control the d file over here. Yeah, that will be slightly nicer for me. In addition, the knight just lost a tempo by actually capturing on d1. The king will also lose his tempo if actually captured on d1 as well. So I think this is slightly nicer for black if he went on that way. But plays rook to d8, where after rook d7, he's still controlling the d file, but the king and the knight is still on the original square that he was on, right? And so there's no problem there. In fact, when it's white to move, white actually continue with pawn to f4, trying to again advance on the king side, trying to create some mess on the king side as well. Ervan continues with king f8, just continuing with the plan or with the wisdom of getting your king involved in the endgame, right? So you can help also with the defense or an attack or whatever that you need to do in the endgame. Now pawn to b4, also now trying to advance on the queen side, trying not to abandon the queen side existence here or advantage here, still trying to win the game. King e8 continued by Ervan, of course, again just continuing to getting the king involved. And after knight to a4, rook d5 and knight c5, we do see after bishop c5 and pawn c5, we do see the b7 pawn is clearly weak as heck over here. A move like rook to b4 in a moment and rook to b7 will prove to be very advantageous for white, and this position spells trouble for black. Now if I plug this position in the chess engine, it will hover around some equal assessment. So what it's basically saying is that black has some chances to win the game, but I think it will be very difficult. White has all the advantage on the queen side and also on the king side right here. Potentially on the center, right? Because after the pawn push, you will see that the king will actually get in as well. So yeah, I think white just has tons of advantage on three sides of the board, the center, the king side, and the queen side. The assessment here of equal is apparently just nonsense for me. And Yakubboev here will actually prove it to us. Ervan continued with pawn to g5, trying to stop the white pawn from rolling. But yeah, of course, this move is just useless. Pawn to e4, attacking the rook after rook to d7, pawn to f5. And we can see that the pawn will actually roll on the king side and also on the center. Not to mention the king will actually get in. Pawn f6, rook to b4, as we said, attacking the b7 pawn. The rook will have to stay for the entire game to protect the pawn on b7, which is not what you want to do in a chess game or a chess endgame, is to have your piece tied down to one pawn in the end. And so rook to e7 signifying that there's nothing that you can do but protecting the pawn and hope that nothing happens. But king to e3, rook to e5, king to d4, protecting the c5 pawn. And after rook back to e7, rook to b3. No rush in this endgame because you know that black's kaput anyway. And after rook to d7, king e3, rook h7. Now here black plays pawn to h5. And of course if you just play rook to d7, we will actually trade the rook off and actually just play king d4. Now this position is just completely winning. We can push pawn to e5 and infiltrate this way onto the king side or onto the queen side. They are both weak, doesn't really matter. And both will actually confer a win for white. So in this position, black tries pawn to h5. But after rook to d6, this is clearly losing for black because rook is already trying to infiltrate on the center and on the king side and on the queen side. And whatever black's trying to do, these weak pawns, to be exact, is just going to be lost. King to e7. First play pawn to e5 is from Yakubboev, trying to just get the king involved as well as quickly as possible. After pawn takes on e5, we see pawn to f6. There's just no stopping this pawn. After king to e8, we do see king to e4. After pawn g4, is not even worried about this pawn on h2. Plays rook to d2. And after rook h3, the king will have an easy job of eating this pawn on the king side and advancing the pawn on the f file right here. Black just continues with a bit with g3. But after king e6, the threat is clear with f7 and rook to d8. It will be too much for black to handle. So rook to h6, trying to pin the pawn to the king, but this is useless of course. After pawn g3, g4, rook to d1. We do see rook h7, rook to d4 trying to get the g4 pawn. And in this particular moment, Ervan resigned the game. Black can try to hover around the 7th rank, but the g4 pawn will be lost anyway. And with it comes a checkmate on the next move. So again, as you can see from this Catalan opening, it started out as a dry opening. It started out as a really dumb opening to go to because of the dry and the drawish position they always see in this position. But it just takes one or two mistakes from an opponent for you to generate a plan to actually kill your opponent that way. And so I think it's always a good choice to play Catalan opening in a tournament where you need a win. And furthermore, I think this opening, Catalan opening, actually confers a great flexibility for both players. And with that said, I think it's very worth it to learn this opening. But that's the first game. We're only starting to get into the excitement right here. So let's move on to the second game. And we are on the second game, and as promised, we'll actually go through some of the games played by top grandmasters right here. And this game is actually played in a candidates tournament, where the winner of this tournament goes on to play Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship title. The white side is played by Anish Giri, the top player in the Netherlands, and the black side of this game is held by Wang Hao, number 2 player in China at the time of playing. And as always, the theme of this tournament, because it is double round robin, you will always try to win with white and draw with black to ensure you have a maximum number of points to actually reach the first place and win the tournament. And with that said, I hope we clarify how important each round is to actually maximize each point that we can obtain to reach the first place in the tournament. So without further ado, let's just begin. Anish Giri starts out with pawn to d4, and after knight to f6, pawn to c4, e6, knight to f3, d5, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castle, castle, and after pawn takes on c4, we have the classical Catalan position over here. And as usual, because Anish Giri needs to win in this game, he plays queen to c2. Wang Hao retaliates with the main line and plays pawn to a6, and after pawn to a4, to play bishop to d7. The plan is of course to bring it to c6. This is nothing new, we've talked about this. So after queen takes c4, bishop to c6. And Anish Giri continues with bishop to f4 rather than bishop to g5 to control the strong diagonal over here. And Wang Hao immediately challenged it with bishop to d6. Now, as we've mentioned in the second episode of the series, white is really not worried about capturing on f4, because after pawn takes on f4, we have the open g-file, and also we have 2 pawns that is controlling the e5 square. So this is nothing new here. And here, Anish Giri plays knight to c3, and after the exchange, take a guess of what Wang Hao played in this position. Wang Hao played pawn to a5. Remember the last game we talked about this a5 move being very important for white? Now black stops it immediately with pawn to a5 himself. This move is a multi-purpose. The first one is to stop pawn to b4. The second one, as we said, is to stop white from actually controlling the queen side by playing pawn to a5. And the third move is actually trying to get the knight out by knight to a6. Later on, we can see that knight will actually jump to b4, where it actually posted an outpost right there, because obviously it cannot be kicked away by a or c pawn that is non-existent currently in the position. In this position, Anish Giri continued with pawn to e3, just solidifying whatever is on d4 and f4, so in turn it can solidify whatever is on center of the board. As we can see, this pawn is controlling many square, like d4, d5, e5, and then f5, g5, and c5 as well, so it controls a lot of the space on the center of the board. Wang Hao continues with the plan of knight to a6, trying to bring it to b4 at some point to actually help control d5 square. So far so good for both sides. And white here plays knight to e5 himself, initiating the exchange of the bishop because the bishop on c6 is also very strong. So after Wang Hao exchange it, he plays pawn to c6. Now pawn to c6 is actually a very good move because it controls the d5 square and also controls the b5 square, so that the potential jump onto b5 is very impossible for white right now. So we have white trying to control the center of the board, but also we have black trying to prove that it is okay in this position as well. Now Anish Giri could have continued with rook to g1, tuck the king on h1, and also launch the pawn on h4 to attack the king this way, but chose to play a little bit more conservatively and play pawn to h3. This move stops knight g4 from coming, so it's actually a very nice move, prophylactic chess that is, and then continued by Wang Hao with queen to b6. Now I thought of this as a funny move, because queen b6 actually does nothing in the position. The move queen to b6 actually threatens nothing. It's not even threatening to take on b2, because this is such a classic trap for black to fall into. And let's say we could just play rook to c1 in this position to bait black to take on b2. And let's say if black takes on b2, then of course we can actually just play rook back to b1, where if the queen runs to a3 and or c2, we always have this pawn being taken at the end of the day. And so white is not really losing a pawn, but white will have a menacing attack onto the 7th rank that black wishes it could have prevented. And it is going to be the same if the queen runs to c2. We'll have rook to c1, and the only square that does not hang the queen will be f5, where b7 still falls in the end of the day. And so because of that, queen b6 looks like a very odd move. In my opinion, something like knight to b4 would have been a better move, trying to control d5 square right away, because again, the knight could have been kicked off. And so really it poses a annoying outpost on b4 right there. So I thought knight b4 would have been slightly better than queen b6. That apparently does nothing in this position, in my opinion. But if there's anything that queen b6 does, it actually frees up the d8 square for the rook to occupy, right? Before he's being occupied by the queen, but because he moved it to b6, now the d8 square is free to be occupied by the rook on the a file or the f file. In this position, Anish Giri still continued with queen to e2, trying to protect the pawn on b2, but also trying to maintain the flexibility that he will transfer the queen over to the king side right here. At the moment, it's very impossible to bring the queen to g4 and h5, but in the future, when a knight move, it will be very possible. Now here I thought black's actually playing a strange move, and again it has to do with pushing a pawn that weakens the position at the end of the day, and he plays pawn to c5. Now we agree on this position earlier that pawn to c6 actually blocks some of the square that the knight might have jumped to, right? Or perhaps in the end of the day, the queen have jumped to b5. It helps control the d5 square from the push of the pawn, and in the end tries to maintain the balance of this position. But the move pawn to c5 actually surprised many of us, because again, the queen could have jumped there, knight could have jumped there, could have planned for d5 as well. And so really we do not understand why Wang Hao plays like this. And if anything, during the live broadcast, the 5-time world champion Vichy Anand already planned for something like queen to b5 rather immediately, where after queen takes and pawn takes, the knight has to move, and after pawn takes on c5, you can see that the pawn actually is threatening to queen right here. It controls the space on the queen side and on the center of the board. In this position, what will be much better, if not winning already. And so certainly c5 is quite odd move right here. And Giri here continues with rook after d1, just planning if the pawn were to take on d4, the rook will actually take on d4. Wang Hao continues to change the structure of this game by playing pawn takes d4, and after rook to d4, we do see rook a to d8, trying to exchange off the rook on the center of the board. And here Anish Giri continued with rook takes d8, and after queen takes d8, he then continued with rook to d1, trying to attack the queen, trying to control the whole d file so he can infiltrate right here. Now the question is if rook takes d8 here is possible, in turn controlling the d file for black himself. But in this position, there's always queen to b5, as we've mentioned earlier, trying to exchange the queen. And if the queen takes, we get pawn takes, which is very nice in the end of the day. Where if knight to c7, we can actually just play rook to a5. We're up a pawn right here, we can actually infiltrate. This pawn on b5 is actually very annoying. And so this position will be borderline winning, if not winning. And of course, if queen to c7, I suppose something like knight to c4 attacks the pawn, and there's nothing that actually can protect it. b6 hangs the pawn because there are two pieces trying to attack it. And it also hangs the knight right here on a6. Impossible to play. So in any case, what is better in that line? So he plays queen to d8, so that after queen to b5, he can play queen to a8, a resource that he has in the game to protect the pawn on b7 and the knight on a6, and also threatens to play something like b6, where it actually delivers a check to the king. Now, of course, if he play queen to a5, there will be b6. This is a check. The queen is hanging, so this will not be very nice. And let's say that white plays the same thing with knight to c4, then something like b6 delivering the check, plus rook to b8. Actually, this one will defend the pawn, because after knight to b6, we could see queen b7, because this knight cannot move. Once it moves back to c4, I think we can just go for perpetual right here with like queen to f3, and f2 is weak. Of course, queen to a6 would have led to queen to f2 check, and this will be a draw position, I think. White-black will have some perpetual in the end of the day with king to h1, queen to f3, and so on and so forth. And king g1, queen g3, king f1, queen to h3. Yeah, in any case, you don't want to actually allow this for black. First, Anish Giri plays a prophylactic move of king to g1, so that after pawn to b6 or b5, it won't be a check. Now finally in this position, Wang Hao moves his knight to b4, where it controls the d5 square. The next move, maybe we'll actually bring it to d5 as well to exchange the knight off. It's also very possible. Here Anish Giri just continues with queen to b5, preparing to enter the queen side if possible. And after knight d5 from Wang Hao, Anish Giri exchanged a pair of knight and plays rook to c1, preparing to get this rook and the queen to on the queen side. Prepares to get all the major pieces on the 7th rank, where it actually attacks f7, the weakest pawn on the board right now. Here Wang Hao plays pawn to h6, a very prophylactic move to save the king from any back rank mate. And after queen to d7, infiltrating on the 7th rank, we see knight to f6 attacking the queen, queen back to d6. And in this position, I thought that Wang Hao actually blundered. He played a move where it seemingly looked like it does nothing in this position, but will actually have a severe complications on his king side later on. He plays a move pawn to g6, Now pawn to g6 doesn't seem like it's harmful because there's nothing that can reach the king anyway. There's no immediate checkmate, there's no immediate winning a piece. But remember we mentioned about this f7 pawn being the weakest pawn on the board. It has a job of defending the pawn on e6 earlier on. But with the inclusion of g6, suddenly it is defending the e6 pawn but also defending the g6 pawn. And so in the future something like knight to g6 can actually occur, where after pawn to g6 this e6 pawn is really hanging. With queen to e6 it is check. And of course in this line there's only a queen in this position, so it's not enough to checkmate. But Anish Giri could prepare something similar of the line to actually checkmate black in this position. And so I think g6 is actually a terrible blunder to continue the game because it actually provides another weakness for white to attack. Some move that Wang Hao could have played perhaps will be something like queen to e8 where it protects the f7 pawn and also tries to, defend the whole 7 and 8 rank with the queen and the major pieces, bring it back and forth that way. But pawn to g6 actually induces another weakness in this position that Anish Giri immediately sees. He first played pawn to b3 though because there's no immediate rook to c7 due to the move of knight to e8, forking both the queen and the rook. So b3 is one of those moves where it tries to create a weaknesses on the queen side as well. Wang Hao continues with pawn to h5 and again king to h2 right here, a move that seemingly does nothing in this position, but again it's just trying to ask Wang Hao what it's trying to do because in this position Wang Hao also could have done nothing other than weakening this position of his king side. Wang Hao continued with king to g7, hoping there's nothing in this position that could cause him some harm. But Anish Giri calmly continued with queen to d4, and after rook to d8, goes to b2 to prepare pawn to b4 right here. Queen b8 by Wang Hao, again there's nothing that black could have done, besides hovering the queen and the rook around the 8 file, the 8 rank right here, to actually protect the last rank. Pawn to b4 by Anish, and after ab4, rook to c4, trying to attack the pawn this way, trying to double up on a b file, so it's very possible. After pawn to b3, rook to b4, we do see queen to a7, but this actually does nothing. Anish continued with rook to b3. Now of course queen to b3 would have been winning as well, but rook to b3 sacrificing a4 pawn so you can get rook to b7. And even if Wang Hao has queen to e8 in this position, we can see that the rook can actually come to a7, the queen can come to b7, and it will be in a full infiltration on the 7 rank right here. Giri continued with rook to a7, wasting no time, and after rook to d5, plays queen to b7. Now we see 3 pieces stacking on the f7 square, and only 2 pieces, which is the king and the queen defending the f7 square. And so after knight to e4, we see knight to f7, and Wang Hao resigned the game. Now Wang Hao resigned the game because there's nothing that he could have done in the position. All these pawns are weak, and there's nothing that actually is going on the king side for white. For black, if he tries to bring his knight back to f2 to actually take the pawn, then something like knight to g5 is good. Knight to e7 is good, where it actually exposed the entire 7 rank for the checkmate idea. And if he plays king g8, then I suppose something like knight to h6 is also threatening the checkmate very soon. Where in fact, if king h8, there's already queen to g7 or queen h7 checkmate. And it all starts out with a mistake that Wang Hao played, which seems harmless in the position, but actually is weakening the position quite a bit, which is pawn to g6 in this position. And hopefully by now, with so many review games, you understand that Catalan opening is actually quite drawish and dry in the opening, but it only takes one small mistake from your opponent for you to generate a plan to actually kill your opponent that way. And so that's how I want to end this video. There is going to be a second part of the review games for the Queen C2 lines, where we're going to review some of the best games played by Grandmasters again, so I hope you can stay tuned for that. And as always, if you liked the video, consider subscribing to this channel. And again, as always, thanks for watching. Thank you. See you in the next one.